A time for questions about this, and welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks. Bust my dirty. Okay, so I just wanted to start by just kind of explaining how I managed to do a lecture on Nazi laws and also write an opera. I started out as a musician, a composition and theory major. I didn't even know we had 3 branches of government until I was in college. I mean, I was like, I did a lot of professional music stuff growing up. And so anyway, I did the opera and I was getting close to finishing it. And the Holocaust Museum in DC announced that they were offering a fellowship in law and the Holocaust. And I got accepted as one of the fellows. So I got Sarah and her twin sister their first cell phones and sent them out on the mall and said, don't call me if you have a fight, just call me if you need something. And of course the first call was, Mom, man wants to, so, but anyway, that got me interested in law and the Holocaust. And then I created one of the first law school classes on law and the Holocaust. And that was about 20 years ago. So I've been giving this lecture and studying the Holocaust, and I always tell people, I feel like it's a non-stop learning opportunity for me, even though I know a lot. So like we just had a conversation earlier, and I learned things I didn't know. So I always love giving these lectures because the questions and the conversation really, there's just so much to know and so much to learn. I am going to ask that people hold their questions because usually people ask questions about things that are going to come up anyway. But it'll take about an hour to go through the slides. There's some historical videos and stuff in the slides. And then I'll take whatever questions you have at the end, and we can have a discussion about anything you like. Okay, so, I'm not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so, just very briefly, before World War I, Germany had been many disparate states and then a monarchy, and there had been 3 Kaisers starting in 1871. The third Kaiser Wilhelm II was the monarch during World War I and ended up abdicating at the end of World War I, and before the Versailles Treaty was signed. And so this left like a real political vacuum in Germany. So things about Germany that are sort of worth knowing is that it was carried out under the Kaiser. It was fought largely off German soil. And so to the German, and there was no CNN or Fox News then, and so of course the information that the German populace had came from their own reports from their government, returning soldiers and that sort of thing. Because the war wasn't fought in Germany, they really didn't understand that Germany was being defeated on the battlefields. And so when the war ended, the German populace was very shocked. They had given up a lot to, they'd sacrificed a lot to have the war prosecuted. And so there was this real anger that the war had ended. And you may have heard, Hitler was really angry when the war ended, and a lot of the populace was really angry when the war ended. And so that led to this notion that Germany couldn't possibly have lost the war because of what was happening, in Germany, but lost the war instead because there was an internal stab in the back. And guess who they blamed? Us, Jews, but also communists. There was a lot of overlap at the time between the Communist Party and Jews. The head of the Communist Party was a Jew. And so this, sort of increased, I guess, some already existing anti-Semitism. So then the war ends on November 9th. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated. He left the country. There was an armistice on November 11th, which is why we celebrate Veterans Day on November 11th. And then right away, within 2 months, the, like I said, there was this political vacuum, and so there was a decision to have a general election to create an assembly to create a new government. And so that election met, the people that were elected met in Weimar. That's why the constitution for the country between 1918 and 1933, when Hitler took over, was called the Weimar Republic. The constitution itself was drafted in Weimar. The populace was, at the time, extremely polarized. You had the far, far right, which was the sort of violent right. Some of this is going to sound very familiar. You had the conservative right, which were, they were more sort of monarchists, and they didn't approve of democracies, and they were terrified that Germany, which is very close to Russia, was going to slide into a communist country. Then on the left, you had the communists who wanted to create a Soviet-like government in Germany. And the Social Democratic Party, which was the centrist party, basically was able to cobble together enough of the center to convince everybody that they should try to become a democracy, basically with a parliamentary system. And so they had these elections, but as these elections were happening before and after, you had all these uprisings on the left and the right. So you had these really violent uprisings on the left and on the right. And so there was a lot of violence in the street. I'm going to show you actually, actually first I have a video about the Weimar Constitution. So hang on, this is the thing that we need to try. Okay, so I'm gonna do a video, Drew. I'm gonna turn off my sound. No, leave my sound on low. Yes. And turn off my mic. Okay, it's not letting me. It's not letting me, it's not letting me fix this.
February 1919. In Weimar, once home to Goethe and Schiller, the fall of the emperor paves the way for a freely elected National Assembly of the First German Republic. Democracy is completely new for many citizens.
I can remember my relatives speaking of a woman, a teacher's widow, who had volunteered to put up 3 delegates. They were saying, how can this lady take such people into her home?
The delegates come to Weimar because there's unrest in Berlin. In 1918, the Great War had been lost. The emperor had been overthrown, and now the communists are hustling for power. In January 19, there's an uprising. It is crushed brutally. For the first time, women are allowed to both stand and vote in this election for the National Assembly. Parties pushing for a parliamentary republic receive a 2/3 majority. The SPD becomes the strongest party. Its leader, Friedrich Ebert, becomes the first president of the Weimar Republic.
Das Wesen unserer Verfassung soll vor allem Freiheit sein. Freiheit für alle Volksgenossen. Aber jede Freiheit, an der mehrere teilnehmen, muss ihre Satzung haben.
After many months of deliberation, the delegates enact the so-called Weimar Constitution. Germany becomes a democratic republic. The government is no longer responsible to the emperor, but to parliament. For the first time in German history, government authority emanates from the people. The Constitution follows on from the failed revolution of 1848 and the ideals of the Paulskirche Assembly. Black, red, and gold, representing the German liberal tradition, are the chosen colors of the Weimar Republic. But the new state must bear the consequences of the war. The Treaty of Versailles allows victors to dictate their terms. Germany loses 1/7 of its territory and must pay reparations.
Everyone called it the shameful Treaty of Versailles. Of course, without having read the many hundreds of paragraphs. There was great unanimity against the Versailles Treaty.
Protests are also directed against the Republic. Supposedly, the Democrats and Socialists abandoned the victorious troops, the so-called stab in the back. The lie proves effective. Already in the first elections to the Reichstag in June 1920, the government parties of the Weimar Republic, the Social Democrats, Catholic Center Party, and the left liberals lose their majority. They would never regain this power. From the very beginning, also in Parliament, the young democracy faces determined opposition.
I'll have this dance down by the time. Okay, so the Weimar Constitution does pass, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how the government was structured. Where we're driving to at the very end of this is I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think are similar and risks that we have and things that are different. The Constitution was very similar, but it had a different Achilles heel. I think we may have a couple that I didn't really think about until recently, but there were some really big Achilles heels in the Weimar Constitution. So first of all, it's a parliamentary system, not a system quite like ours. And so you'll notice some differences related to that. So first of all, there was both a president and a chancellor. The president was elected for 7 years, and let's see, there we go. Eligible for re-election and recall by popular vote by 2/3 majority of the Reichstag, which I'll talk about in a minute, and Friedrich Ebert, who you just saw, was the first president. It also established the role of chancellor, which was the role that Hitler was first given in 1933. The chancellor is appointed by the president and is basically the political leader of the government, determines the political program, the legislative agenda, and that sort of thing. Then there's a cabinet, which is the Reich ministers, and those people report to the chancellor. They're recommended by the chancellor, but appointed and dismissed by the president. So the thing to notice about that is already there's some checks and balances there, right? There's shared power in figuring out who's going to be in the cabinet, kind of similar to our deal where the president basically nominates people to run agencies, and then the Senate has to confirm those appointments. The legislative branch was made up of 2 houses of parliament, if you will. One was called the Reichstag. The Reichstag ended up being the really, really important branch. So the Reichstag was elected by the people. It was universal direct election. Anyone over 20, women, it was one of the, remember, women didn't have the vote here yet. And so it was one of the first elections where women got to vote. The term is for 4 years, and they can pass a law by simple majority. So kind of like our House of Representatives. The Senate, which is called the Reichsrat there, is elected by the German states. So it's not a direct connection to the people, it's a direct connection to the state governments. One of the things they were trying to do was make the federal government more powerful and the state governments less powerful. Because remember, Germany had been non-unified up until the mid-1800s. So this was really an attempt to give the federal government more power than the state governments. The Reichsrat had one representative for each state, but for large states, there was there was a representative for every million people, and there was a great disparity in the size of the states. There were some states that were huge, and there were some that were pretty tiny. But no state was allowed more than 2/5 of the number of votes. The legislative process was that the cabinet would introduce legislation. They would usually try to get concurrence of the Reichsrat, the one that the states were represented by. And then the Reichstag was the section of the government, so kind of like our House of Representatives, that actually voted on legislation. Once the Reichstag adopted a piece of legislation, it had the chance to be protested by the other house, and the law could be overridden by 2/3 vote of the Reichsrat. So again, balance of power. Then if something still passed and the president didn't like it, he could actually take it directly to the people through a referendum. So that had to be within 3 months, and it would go to a popular vote. So lots and lots of checks and balances, right? So far, so good. But they also put a couple things in there that ended up literally being the death knell for the Weimar Republic a decade later, along with economic conditions, and we'll talk about those in a minute. So first of all, and I'm going to ask you to just sort of put this in the back of your brain, we'll come back to it, but the Constitution could be amended if 2/3 of the members present voted, if 2/3 of the members were present and 2/3 of those voted in favor of amending the Constitution. So it meant you needed a pretty small majority to actually amend the Constitution. Then they had this Article 48, and Article 48 turned out to be quite problematic. So this is the actual text of Article 48, and forgive me, but I'm going to read it because you're all going to be reading it anyway while I'm talking. If any state does not fulfill the duties imposed upon it by the Constitution or the laws of the Reich President may enforce such duties with the aid of the armed forces. And then here's the problematic one. This next section allows the president to basically ride over all civil liberties. In the event that the public order and security are seriously disturbed or endangered, the Reich President may take the measures necessary for their restoration, intervening if necessary with the aid of the armed forces. For this purpose, he may temporarily abrogate, wholly or in part, the fundamental principles laid down in articles, and then it's basically our Bill of Rights, the whole thing. The Reich President, without delay, has to inform the Reichstag of all measures taken under paragraph 1 or 2, and the Reichstag may vote to annul those measures. And then lastly, under Article 25, the president had the right to dissolve the Reichstag and completely call for new elections and get a new Reichstag. So, you know, for a new democracy, these were things that could be used well, or they were things that could be used to destabilize the democracy, and in the end, they were used to destabilize the democracy. President Ebert himself used Article 48 136 times while he was president, but the difference between him and later use is that he always returned to power. He would give the rights back as soon as whatever it was he was working with was fixed. And as you may know, Germany had a lot of really heavy-duty economic problems like the rest of the world during this time. They had problems, I'm going to go through this on the next slide, but in the early 1920s while we were sort of in the roaring 20s, and then they recovered a little bit, and then in 1929 when our stock market crashed and the world went into a Great Depression, they were really in bad shape. Okay, so this is just stuff that happened after the Weimar government came into being. I'm not going to walk through this entire slide, but you still had lots and lots of political stress on both sides. You had violent uprisings on both sides. And then Germany was forced to pay pretty substantial reparations as part of the Versailles Treaty. Ebert was the one who had gone and signed the Versailles Treaty, and it was literally like days after the new government was formed, right? Because the monarch had left, And there wasn't time to have instantaneous elections. And so the Social Democratic Party kind of stepped into the void, and they were the ones who signed the Versailles Treaty, which was very unpopular in Germany. And so Germany was supposed to start paying their reparations in 21. They fell behind. And then basically France sent in troops to occupy portions of Germany, the industrial Ruhr Valley. And in order to kind of fix this, Germany basically told striking workers that they would pay them. And in order to do that, they printed money. That resulted in hyper inflation. And I don't know if you all remember, I remember in elementary school seeing the picture of a kid bringing a wheelbarrow to buy a loaf of bread. So this is the same thing. These are kids on the picture on the left playing with money, piles of money. So the money became completely worthless. In November of 23, a US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. So like you couldn't even carry enough money with you to pay for anything. Then in November of 1923, you had the beer hall putsch. Have you guys heard of that? That was when Hitler was still in his sort of nascent political leadership days. And he had this notion that he could just ride on in and, you know, do a violent takeover of the government. He learned his lesson from this, by the way, and the next time he tried to take over the government, he did it but going through the political channels. So I think there's a movie coming up, Drew, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so let us adjust.
In Munich in 1923, in the atmosphere of crisis caused by the occupation of the Ruhr, Hitler and the Nazis acted. Hitler stood on the stage of the Bürgerbräukeller on November the 8th and interrupted a right-wing political meeting. He called for a national revolution to start in Bavaria and overthrow the left-wing government in Berlin. The next day, the Nazis, together with other right-wing parties, marched through Munich to gain support. They were stopped by the police at the War Memorial at the Feldherrnhalle. The Nazis hoped the army and police, many of whom supported right-wing parties, would join them in a march on Berlin.
Wir haben geglänzt als Marschierer und kommen dann in die Maximilianstraße, die überkreuzen wir. Und wie ich dann an die Ecke der Residenz komme, hören wir die Schüsse fallen.
The police didn't support them. Shots were fired, and the marchers were routed. Hitler fled from the scene. 4 policemen and 16 Nazis lost their lives.
Sie haben mich schon einmal gefragt, was ich da für Emotionen gehabt habe. Ne? Da möchte ich sagen, ja, da habe ich eigentlich die ersten politischen Emotionen gehabt, ne? Wie etwas schief gehen kann. Ne? Das war schon an sich ein Schlag für mich und für viele meiner Kameraden, dass das passieren konnte.
So Hitler was arrested for treason, and he was tried, and he was put in jail. And he writes Mein Kampf while he's in jail. He was actually released early. And in 1924, when he got out of jail, he realized that if he was going to influence the direction of the country, he would probably need to do it through the political system, not through violence, and not through rogue violence as opposed to state-sponsored violence. And so in 24, the Nazis made a little bit of a showing in the elections that were held then. Is this on okay? Okay. And then in 1925, Paul von Hindenburg was elected as the president. So Hindenburg had been a war hero in World War I. He was very conservative. He was very old. He used Article 48 numerous times. and just like his predecessor. Under him, and then he remained president until his death in 1934, so we'll get to that in order. But the presidency was extraordinarily stable in the Weimar Republic, the chancellorship, not so much. In fact, I started to create a slide that had all the chancellors and when they served, and it was like 3 slides, and I was like, I think this is too much weeds, right? We don't need to know all of them. But what was happening was, because you had direct representation. So, you know, if the Reichstag was made up of 100 representatives, that's a bad example, 1,000 representatives, then if 100 people voted for the Nazi Party, then they got, you know, that portion of representation. And if 300 people voted, they got that portion. There wasn't anything about state borders or nothing like we have with congressional districts or anything like that. So what ended up happening was, as the population shifted their political affiliations, the makeup of the Reichstag would change, and so would the power structure, and so new chancellors would be appointed. So you had a lot of instability in the chancellorship. Despite that, in the mid-1920s, Germany's economy did a little bit better. That was partially because of currency reform and partially because we bailed them out of the Versailles Treaty, but things definitely got better. Germany joined the League of Nations. The Nazi Party started getting little itty-bitty representation, so 12 seats in the Reichstag in 1928. But then in 1929, of course, you know, the whole economy melted down. And as I think perhaps we're seeing now, in difficult economic times, people seem to be attracted to the extremes. And so again, you had this sorting of political affiliation out of the middle and into the to the extreme left and the extreme right. In 1930, the Nazis got 107 seats in the Reichstag. They were the second largest party. That was in September of 1930. In 1931, 5 of the big German banks collapsed, so the economy's a mess. 1932, the Nazis first became the majority party. So this is 1 year before Hitler becomes chancellor. And then so by 1932, they're the largest party. Sorry, I'm having trouble toggling between. Okay, and then January 30th, 1933, there have been whole books written about this. The powers that be convince the president that they need to keep Hitler close, right? He's got a lot of power in the Reichstag, and he refuses to take any position but chancellor. And so Hindenburg goes ahead and agrees to appoint him chancellor. So I'm going to show you a film. It's very short, of the Nazi Party supporters marching through Berlin the night that Hitler was appointed chancellor. By the way, I don't think people know this, but or not necessarily, but there were a lot of the big department stores were owned by Jewish families in Germany, and that night there was a lot of damage to department stores owned by Jews. Okay, so about to do a film. Okay, so Hitler gets appointed chancellor January 30th of 1933, and he convinces Hindenburg to dissolve the government and hold new elections. The stuff I've read about this request is that, you know, Hitler had a very aggrandized sense of himself, and he figured that this was a time to try and get the Nazi Party's representation in the Reichstag to a higher number. So he prevails on Hindenburg to schedule this election for March 5th. On February 4th, Hindenburg issues a presidential decree that bans political meetings and marches, restricts the press, gives police expanded powers of arrest, and this is all in anticipation of this election on March 5th. And I just want to point out the, I see every time I turn my head, I just want to point out what it was called, the Decree for the Protection of the German People. And I just want to say that I was a little bit horrified by the name on the citizen birth executive order that President Trump issued, because it was called something like for the protection of the gift of US citizenship or something. You're gonna see all of the Nazi proclamations, political proclamations, and some of the anti-Semitic ones were called for the protection of. So it gets this like notion that we're being attacked from outside, we need to protect ourselves. And we'll see this come up in a lot of the pieces of legislation we're gonna look at. Okay, so again, January 30th is when Hitler is appointed. And then on February 27th, the Reichstag, the building where the Reichstag meets, catches on fire and is completely destroyed. We're going to see in a minute that Hitler takes advantage of this to use Article 48 to declare an emergency, and that is the beginning of the end of the Weimar Republic. So I think there's a video. Yes, so let me stop this.
Here you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire. The main hall in which the deputies conducted their debates has suffered most from the conflagration. And after the general election, which is about to take place, Parliament will have to find a temporary home elsewhere. Flames are no respecters of persons, and President Hindenburg's own chair was also destroyed. Hitler, now Chancellor, has announced that the fire was the work of communists and was intended to be the signal for a Bolshevist uprising throughout the country. In consequence, Germany has been placed under a system of martial law, a decree having been signed which aims at the total destruction of communism. Here you see the Reichstag, the German House.
So I often get asked if communists really did burn the Reichstag down, and I have to tell you, I've been studying this stuff for 20 years, and different conclusions about what happened have emerged over time. The current thinking is that Marius van der Lubbe was probably acted alone. He was a communist, but he was also sort of a ne'er-do-well. He'd been arrested for arson at other times, and he probably wasn't acting in consort with the Communist Party, even though he was a communist. But, you know, and over time, there have been theories that the Nazis actually set the fire and they used it as a pretext. So whether they said it or a communist said it, there's no question the Nazis used it as a pretext for a very quick decline of the Weimar government. So right away, the president issued a decree under Article 48, and again, that's that article we saw taking away, you know, civil liberties. And it was called the Reichstag Fire Decree. You may have heard of this. It's probably one of the 3 most important political decrees that were issued by the Nazi Party. It takes away the right to assembly, free speech, free press, It removes restraints on police investigations, and it creates something called protective custody and preventive detention. So what is protective custody and preventive detention? It's I look at you and I say, you know what, you're likely to commit a crime, and so I'm going to arrest you before you commit the crime because that will protect the German public. And of course, it's used in all kinds of ways. It's used to arrest political opponents. It's used to arrest people with mental deficits, with disabilities, with, you know, it's used to arrest all kinds, Jews, it's used to arrest all kinds of people and put them aside so they're out of the way. This is long before there were concentration camps, right? So this is not, you know, this is just the beginning of that sort of gathering and moving away of people. The other thing it does is it makes punishment for crimes more severe, including the death penalty, and it allows the federal government to overrule state laws so that, you know, these states that had a lot of political independence before the Weimar Republic are basically capped at the knees and they can't do anything. And then the title of it, it was framed as a defensive measure against communist acts. So again, this notion that we're under attack from outside, we need to protect ourselves, and we have to defend ourselves. They go ahead with the March 5th election. This is something that I still don't feel like I know enough about. They had certainly taken into preventive detention and protective custody political opponents, this is something that hasn't been written about a lot, at least in many of the sources that I've looked at, so I still feel like I could learn more about this. This is Hitler listening to the results of the March 5th election. The Nazis and the Nationalist Party, which was the conservative pro-monarchy party, actually together only got 52% of the vote, but still enough to have the majority in the Reichstag. So the fire was February 28th, March 24th, 1933. The president signs into law something called the Enabling Act, which was officially called the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. Again, this notion that, like, you know, you're under attack, we're going to protect you. So what does it do? It says the power of the Reichstag, which remember was the popularly elected body, which there had just been an election for on March 5th. All that power is transferred to Hitler, the chancellor. It doesn't name him, but it transfers the power to the position of the chancellor. Laws and constitutions can be changed without permission from either the Reichstag or the president. Laws can deviate for the Constitution. All laws are effective the day after they're passed. And how did they get this passed? How did they get the Reichstag to vote themselves out of existence? Guess what they did? They arrested a lot of the communists that were in the Reichstag using protective custody and preventive detention. And now we go back to the number of parties, the number of votes it took to amend the Constitution, right? Because you only had to have 2/3 of the Reichstag present, and then 2/3 of that 2/3 had to vote. And so if you could arrest the third that was going to present a problem, you could pass this major change to the Constitution. I mean, this would be like, you know, getting rid of the House of Representatives and saying that that power goes to the president, which, by the way, it's much harder to amend our Constitution. But that's basically what they did. So they arrest all these individuals. They detain all 81 communists. They detain 26 of the 120 social democratic representatives. So that's about 1/5 of the Reichstag. Then this is, you know how everyone talks about how there were no acts of political courage during the Holocaust? This is the beginning of the Holocaust, right? And I just want to point out that all 94 Social Democratic Party members voted against this piece of legislation, and at great risk to themselves. But it didn't matter, it passed. So at the end of this, you still have the president, you still have the chancellor, you still have the Reichsrat, but there's a piece of legislation that says the federal government can override what the states do. and the Reichstag is transferred to Hitler, okay? Then on March 29th, so they start issuing legislation fast and furious. March 29th, they do something called the Lex van der Lubbe. Lex means law, so I actually should take the word law out of here because it's duplicative. But basically what they do is, okay, if you get found guilty of the Reichstag fire, you are eligible for the death penalty. It's retroactive to the Reichstag fire. So even though, you know, most laws, we have a constitutional protection against ex post facto laws, which means a law today can only go forward, it can't go backwards. Not here. The Supreme Court of Germany, and I'm going to talk about the court system in a minute, the Supreme Court basically went along with this. They used it retroactively to sentence van der Lubbe, but there were 4 other defendants who were found not guilty, and Hitler was really pissed off about this. And in fact, this is what led him to create the political court during the Nazi regime and during the Holocaust, called the People's Court. And I'll talk about them a little bit later too. By the way, van der Lubbe was exonerated by the German government in 2008. Okay, time for another video.
Inside the German Supreme Court, 5 men are on trial for a crime that helped sweep Adolf Hitler and his party into power. The first being led in, hands manacled after 8 days before the court, is Marinus van der Lubbe, 24-year-old Hollander who has confessed. The others are German and Bulgarian communists. Charged with setting fire to the Berlin Reichstag building, they have been in jail 7 months. The case has stirred up controversy all over the world. Here is the Reichstag building, now being rebuilt. Flames started in 4 places, ruining the giant gilded cupola. The blaze caused more than $1 million damage. Bundles of rags, rugs, and shavings had been soaked in gasoline to start the fire. Police saw men leaving the building and fired on them. Van der Lubbe was seized. These pictures, the first ever made within the German Supreme Court, show the Reichstag case in progress. Heavily guarded, Vasil Konstantinov Tanev, Bulgarian communist. Ernst Torgler Center, a leader of the German Communist Party, another defendant. And van der Lubbe, communist or Nazi agent? The world awaits the answer.
Okay, so I'm going to talk for a minute about some of the anti-Jewish laws. So, you know, this is the first one, April 1st. So Hitler's only been chancellor for like a month and a half, 5 weeks, something like that. And it was a boycott of Jewish businesses. And basically, I picked this photo. There's tons of photos of this event. As you can imagine, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, there was still a lot of foreign press in Berlin and in Germany. As the war went on and as the Holocaust got, you know, kind of got going, there were fewer and fewer news people. So there are fewer and fewer photos, fewer and fewer eyewitness stories and that sort of thing. I picked this picture of this event because this was the government hiring a photographer to stand outside a Jewish business and take pictures of any non-Jewish clients who came into the business so that they could be threatened. In other words, they could basically say, you're going to get in trouble if you come in here, because Berlin especially, was very integrated at the time, and that, you know, people would have a tailor who was Jewish, or they would have, you know, a fruit merchant who was Jewish. And so this was meant to threaten people out of doing business with the Jews. Oh, I forgot, we have another movie. So this is actually a video of the boycott, and I want you to notice that the posters that they put up on Jewish businesses, they're in German and English. And I've never received a good explanation for a while, though I've always thought it was sort of Hitler grandstanding for the English-speaking world that, you know, you better not screw with us, or, you know. Okay, time for another video, Drew. Okay. Hitler was vehemently anti-Semitic, and it is not surprising that he had two goals early in his chancellorship. One was to take political control of Germany, and the other was to start executing some of his anti-Semitic ideas. At this point in time, he probably just wanted to kick Jews out of Germany. I don't think they had quite formulated the idea that they were going to engage in mass genocide. But it is very interesting that the two consistent things throughout his leadership was that he was devoting as much energy to the political situation as he was to his anti-Semitism. And that carried through. It probably helped lose the war for Germany. You see it very, very early. There were other anti-Jewish laws. This one, I'm not going to spend as much time on this one. When I lecture to lawyers and judges, I spend more time on this, but this was basically a decree that kicked Jews out of the civil service. And unlike our society, in Germany, a lot of professions were considered part of the civil service. So for example, teachers, professors at universities, that was all part of the civil service. Basically they kicked anyone out who was a communist or a Jew. And instead of using the word Jew, they said people who were of non-Aryan descent. And then we get the beginning of this mix of treating Judaism as a religion and as a race, right? So you get some decrees where they look at your blood content, which by the way, they got from us. Well, that's how we defined who was Black. It's how we defined who was Native American. It's still how we define who's eligible for Bureau of Indian Affairs benefits. But then they would also sometimes define a Jew as someone who is observant or belongs to a temple. So it was kind of like this, both like a race thing and a religion thing. And at different times, in different legislation, they described it differently. I'm going to skip this, but lawyers were kicked out of their practice. Again, I give this lecture a lot to members of the bar and to judges, but they kicked members of the bar out of practice. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the videos. With the slides. They kicked Jewish lawyers out of the Bar Association, but in the early anti-Jewish legislation, there was an exception for if you had served in World War I, and a lot of Jews had served Germany in World War I, were awarded the Iron Cross. There's a really famous historian, Saul Friedlander, who thinks that by his research, and this is towards the bottom, of the 4,585 Jewish lawyers practicing in Germany, 3,167 were allowed to continue their work. There was later legislation that completely kicked Jews out of practicing law, same thing with medicine, same thing with journalism, but originally, if you had served in World War I, you got an exemption. And so this photograph is of Jewish lawyers lining up at the Berlin Bar Association to demonstrate that they met the requirements for being exempt from having to leave the profession. Those of us in the United States, when all these things started happening fast and furious, so April 1's the boycott, April 7th was the Bar Association, the Reich citizenship law the civil service law that fired civil servants, that was all within the first few days. And there were protests all over the United States. I'm sure there were protests in Pittsburgh. This happens to be a picture of Cleveland, where I live. This is public auditorium, for those of you that know Cleveland. There was a huge rally in support of German Jews. And then you don't need to change the sound for this one. This is a silent video. I'm only going to play a second of it, but this was a march in support of German Jews in Chicago. Someone posted they're not hearing anything from the video. It's a silent video. So, okay, so remember, we no longer have the Reichstag, right? In January of 1934, so now we're like in the next year, so he's been chancellor for a year, he gets the president to sign a decree that gets rid of all the state parliaments at the state level. And then in February, he gets the president to sign something getting rid of the Reichsrat, which was the smaller house that was representatives from the state governments. And Hindenburg, who was the president, is still president. And Hitler knows that he isn't going to be able to get Hindenburg to give up power, because Hindenburg's now the only other position of power that's left. Hindenburg was really old at this point. He was 86 in the summer of 1934. In August of 1934, the day before Hindenburg dies, he gets Hindenburg to sign basically a law that eliminates Hindenburg's position. It's called the Law Re, the Sovereign Head of the German Reich, and it consolidates the office of the president and chancellor into a position called Führer. So that is when he became a dictator, right? He just had now gotten rid of all the other branches of government, transferred the power to himself. It was very legalistic. I don't want to say it was legal, but it was done by legal annihilation of the other branches of government. Next day, Hindenburg dies. And then on August 19th, another vote that I have looked for material about, but I have not been able to find very much. But there was a plebiscite approving Hitler. He got a 90% vote. The little bit I've read was, that because there was so much protective custody and preventive detention and so much fear at that point, that people felt obliged to vote for him. And then this one is, again, important for lawyers, but this is really important for everyone. Until August of 1934, when lawyers took an oath, when judges took an oath, it would say, "I swear loyalty to the Constitution, obedience to the law, and conscientious fulfillment of the duties of my office, so help me God." On August 20th, Hitler rewrote that so that the oath was to him, not to the Constitution. "I swear I'll be true and obedient to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, observe the law, and conscientiously fulfill the duties of my office, so help me God." And then this is actually a picture of German judges taking this oath. All right, really quickly about the Nuremberg laws. You've probably heard of the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws are called the Nuremberg laws because they were adopted at the Party Congress in the town of Nuremberg. That was one of the reasons they picked the town of Nuremberg for the post-genocide trials. So there were two Nuremberg laws. One was called the Reich Citizenship Law, and the other was called the Law for the Protection, there's that word again, of German blood and honor. The Reich Citizenship Law basically said you're only a citizen if you're of Aryan descent. So it basically takes away the citizenship of anyone who is not of Aryan descent. And then the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor basically prohibited, we're going to skip this video, prohibited sexual relations and marriage between Aryans and non-Aryans. Yeah, so they had some wrangling over defining who was a Jew and who wasn't, what was sexual intercourse and what wasn't, what was sexual relations. It actually went up to the German Supreme Court. We're going to take a look at that in just a moment. Okay, so other anti-Jewish legislation, there was so much of it. You can go to a bunch of different websites, Yad Vashem, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, they have lists of anti-Jewish legislation. This is a small sampling, But if you look at the passport here, it's stamped with a J, and it's for someone named Clara Sarah Kasperi, I think. So two of the pieces of legislation were if you were a woman and you were Jewish, you had to add Sarah as your middle name. And if you were a man, you had to add Israel as your middle name. And then you had to have a J stamped on your passport. The one in the middle is, of course, the Jewish star. That didn't come in until the like 41, 42, depending on where in Europe it was. And then the far left, top right is actually a post-war photo, but you can see the bench says nicht für Juden, which means not for Jews. So there were certain roads Jews couldn't walk on. There were certain benches they couldn't sit on. They weren't allowed to swim in swimming pools. They weren't allowed to go to theaters. Although this is a separate topic, but the Nazis actually created an artistic organization called the Kulturbund, which was just for Jews. And because there were so many artists who were Jewish, they had this amazing orchestra, they had an amazing theater, all for Jews. They had camps for Jewish kids. It's pretty bizarre, if you ask me. There's a wonderful book about the Kulturbund called The Inextinguishable Symphony. I highly recommend it. Anyway, okay. So, all right, courts. We're going to talk about courts real quick. Then we're going to, I'll take whatever questions you had. So this is actually, we were just talking about the Green series there were a bunch of Nuremberg trials after the war. There was the one everyone knows about, which was the major war criminals. But then there were actually a bunch after that. There was a trial of medical professionals. There was a trial of jurists and law professionals. There was a trial for industrialists who used slave labor. So there were a bunch of other trials. And as part of the jurist trial, they have this nice little flow chart of what the courts look like. This is what our court structure looks like. There's a Supreme Court, there's mid-level courts. Below that, there's trial courts. And then for really, really small stuff, there's local courts. So we call them small claims courts or that sort of thing. There was an appeal hierarchy, and the courts functioned quite a bit like our courts, and they had done that before the Weimar Republic. And a lot of the judges who were judges in the Weimar Republic had been judges during the monarchy. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. The Supreme Court was asked to interpret the Nuremberg laws on the protection of German blood, so the no-sex law. And so I don't know if any of you, if you're not a lawyer, this is probably boring as all get-go, but one of the things we talk about in law is how to interpret words, which these three are studying, not in the course of law, right, including my daughter. And we've talked about this a lot because this is one of the classes I teach in law school. A legislature, even trying to do its very best, can't always use words exactly how they mean. And so those of us who are using the laws later on end up having to interpret them, right? And I literally have a 4-page list of interpretive ways for my students, right? And in fact, by the way, that's what's going to happen with the birth citizenship issue in the United States, because the 14th Amendment has, if you're born here, you're a citizen, and then there's a clause after that kind of muddies the waters. There was a 1890s case that said that's anyone born in the United States, and Trump is interpreting it differently, and there's now a lawsuit, and the judges, ultimately the Supreme Court is going to have to interpret those words, right? So what's shocking about this opinion is that it reads like a modern day statutory interpretation opinion. So the court was asked to decide the following question: whether the term sexual relations in the context of Article 11 of the First Ordinance for Implementation of the Law, blah, 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 for the protection of German blood is to be understood as referring only to intercourse, acts similar to intercourse, or illicit sexual acts. And they end up holding that it doesn't include every kind of sexual act, but it's not restricted to sexual intercourse. That's the holding of the opinion. But the reasoning is the same as any statutory interpretation. You look at the words chosen by the drafters. Why did they use this word, not that word? You look at the phrase or the word in the context of the purpose of the whole statute. And then you try and figure out what the legislature meant in context of the purpose of the statute. What is the intent or purpose of the law itself? And so, you know, if you read, for lawyers to read this opinion, it's shocking because it could have been written by any judge in the United States. They're asking the question, basically, who's going to get in trouble for having a sexual relationship with someone who's non-Aryan if they're Jewish or vice versa. So anyway, that's just something to think about. There are a lot of judges who think that the Supreme Court, that was the opportunity for the German Supreme Court to say, we're not going to do this. There's a lot of debate over that, right, because of the role of judges. This is why when I teach judges this, it takes a half a day, because we talk about the role of judges and how much freedom they have to be moralistic and that sort of thing. Okay. Remember I said that Hitler was pissed off that the van der Lubbe got off, the other 4 defendants got off for the Reichstag fire. So he was like, well, I'm just going to create my own courts. So that's what he did. He created 3 different kinds of courts. The first one that they created was called the special courts, sometimes called the court-martial courts of the home front. Those were literally political courts, so for political crimes. They were to combat anti-Nazi activity, 3 judges, no right of appeal. Then they created the People's Court, which you may have heard of, and I'll tell you in a minute why you may have heard of them. They were created in 1934. They did treason cases, 5 judges, 2 lay judges, and 3 appointed by the SS. So those were 5 people on the court who were locked and loaded, you know, against anyone who appeared before them. Then there were the hereditary health courts, which I'm not going to talk about, but those were the sterilization courts. You could actually, the state could petition to have people sterilized if they had this notion that criminality, mental defects, physical defects, everything was in your blood. And so if we just sterilize anybody who's got a defect, then we'll have perfect Aryans in the next generation. So that was the theory behind that court. And of course, that program was where they first used gas to kill people, which was then, of course, later used in the concentration camps. The special courts, I think I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit, but I will tell you that there's a very famous case called the Katzenberger case. Did anyone see Judgment at Nuremberg with Judy Garland? If you haven't, you should. It's a great movie. But she plays Irene Seiler, and this is the real Irene Seiler. Irene was not Jewish. Her father and Katzenberger, who was the head of, I forgot what town now, Nuremberg maybe, I can't remember. He was the head of the Jewish community. They were friends. Her father died, and he became like a father figure to her. And they were accused of having a sexual relationship, which the Supreme Court had already said was, you know, anything, it didn't just have to be intercourse, it could be something else. The case itself lasted 1 day. The evidence focused on the hereditary, you know, like the heritage of each defendant to prove that he was a Jew and that she wasn't. And then they used this other statute called the Folkpest Law, which meant you could get increased sentences if you did something taking advantage of the war. And if you did that and they found you guilty of that, you could get the death penalty. So they basically said that she would take advantage of blackouts during air raids to sneak into his apartment and have relations with him. And they both testified that they had a father-daughter relationship, that there was nothing sexual about their relationship at all. Didn't matter. They were both found guilty. And he was sentenced to death and killed, and she was sentenced to 2 years hard labor, which meant she survived the war, and that's why she testified in the Juris case, the Nuremberg case. Again, the opinion reads like one of our opinions. First question is he a Jew? Here's his heritage. Second question, is she not a Jew? Here's her heritage, et cetera, et cetera. And then, have you guys heard of Der Stürmer? That was the very anti-Jewish newspaper that, I can't think of his name right now. Anybody remember his name? Okay, the guy who was the publisher, whose name I cannot retrieve from my brain at the moment, he was one of the defendants in the Nuremberg case. This is what he published afterwards. The world Jewry will discover that Germany knows how to defend herself with the severe measures against Jewish race defilers. This is about the Katzenberger case. Now it will again write using the old long-tried tactics about the medieval conditions prevailing in Germany. It will again glorify those poor, deplorable, harmless Jews who become the victims of National Socialist legislation. It will give vent to spite and malice towards Germany. And this stuff was not just, this was like actually posted in big version all over the city. I don't know, have any of you ever been to Berlin? They still have these like, you know, sort of towers on street corners where they post notices and that sort of thing, so that this was always posted there. The People's Court, which was the treason court, the reason you may have heard of the People's Court is because the People's Court handled the case of the people that tried to bomb Hitler in 1944. You may have heard of like Stauffenberg, if you saw the movie with Tom Cruise. So that court was the one that the assassination plot defendants were tried in. And also the White Rose members, Sophie Scholl and her brother and their friend. So those were two very famous cases out of the People's Court. Unfortunately, and I say this because I really wish he had gone to trial, Roland Freisler, the head judge of the court, was killed in a bombing at the very end of the war, so he never was tried. Okay, so let's see, this is, okay, I know what this is. Okay, this is a very short clip of Freisler at the assassination plot trial. And interestingly, when I first started giving this lecture, I found this on YouTube, and it has since been pulled from YouTube because it's so violent. But it's also, you can't see it then, and it's a piece of history, so that raises a whole nother, you know, can of worms we could talk about. Okay, Drew, I'm gonna show a movie now.
An die vielen Morde. Morde? Im Inland Sie sind ja ein Schäbiolum! Brechen Sie unter der Gemeinheit? Ja oder nein? Verbrechen Sie darunter? Herr Präsident, ja oder nein auf eine klare Antwort? Nein. Nein, Sie können auch nicht mehr zerbrechen. Denn Sie sind ja nur noch ein Häufchen Elend. Ja, kein Häufchen. Sie haben gewartet, bis man die Dienstverpflichteten. Und zwar, wo sind Sie hingegangen? Chemische Erzeugung, haben keine Ahnung von Chemie. Werden Sie lieber eine Knarre in die Hand genommen? Wäre ich auf dumme Gedanken gekommen? Aber natürlich! Sie haben ja bestätigt, dass Sie KV sind. Also, und werden Sie hier nicht unverschämt?
Okay, and then the hereditary health courts. So I think this is a good time to stop and take any questions. I'll give you, as my parting thoughts, you know, why I have faith that I think all democracies are susceptible to this, but why I have faith that we have a lot more protections. But first I'll take any questions. Yes. Oh, wait, we're gonna get the microphone, sorry. Sure. Wait, hang on one second. We're gonna get the microphone.
reverting back for a moment.
Hold the microphone up so everyone can hear.
I'm afraid of microphones.
Oh.
Reverting back for a moment to 1933 at the conception, whatever word you want to use. One of the early photos that you showed from 32 or 33 showed a cadre of uniformed, for lack of a better word, thugs that were his henchmen. Has any research been done about who they originally were? What the original, were they called brown shirts or whatever
Yeah, they were.
or who the original brown shirts were? And the reason I'm asking this is that I've been saying for a week now that the January 6th parolees were paroled because I believe Trump wants to form his own private army. Is there any relationship to what I just said?
Yeah, I mean, there could be. So does Trump want to form his own army? I don't know, but I wouldn't put it past him. About the individuals. Yeah, so I personally don't know if there's information about who they were. I just heard today, and I have not had a chance to verify it, that Hitler actually on his first day in office pardoned the people who participated in the November 9th putsch. So, if I dig deep enough and I find that to be well researched, I'll probably add that to this presentation. Yeah. He did.
Yeah, sorry. Harry Littman said exactly that on MSNBC today.
Yeah.
The reason we're being so strict on the microphone isn't because y'all aren't loud enough for the people in the room. It's because the people on Zoom cannot hear anything that is not said directly into a microphone.
Do we have anything on Zoom that? Yeah, oh, sorry, in the back here.
We'll do the Zoom person on first.
The daughter gets preference, sorry.
Well, I'm reading someone else's question on Zoom, to be fair.
Oh, thank you.
So yes, so someone just wants to know if you have any, this is a very broad topic, but any thoughts on anti-Semitism outside of Germany in 1930s? So I guess if people have a specific question, but.
Well, I mean, you know, as I think most people, so my heritage is Polish. And I remember my grandfather telling me that the German soldiers in his town, which is now in Lithuania, were nicer to him than the locals. And, you know, there was plenty of anti-Semitism to go around, even in the United States. There was the German Bund of the United States. If you look at, the documentarian who's made 5 million I don't know why my brain's not working to retrieve names today, but what is it? It's because it's cold out. That's a good excuse. I like that. It's because it's cold outside. Yeah, America in the Ken Burns. Yes, America and the Holocaust. He covers that in there. So you know, there was anti-Semitism in the United States. This is a whole nother topic, but you know, we had these very restrictive immigration quotas in the United States. And then there was a person in the State Department who made sure they didn't all get passed out. So also another good documentary, there's an American Experience called The U.S. and the Holocaust, which is about our immigration policy in the St. Louis. And so yeah, I mean, yes, there was anti-Semitism everywhere, always, and I think we thought things were better, and of course they've been getting worse and worse.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting.
Thank you.
I partly came because of an interest in history, but mostly I'm looking to see what parallels are there between that time and place and our time and place. And putting aside any and all similarities and differences between the January 6th insurrectionists and the brown shirts, or between Trump, Hitler, blah, 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 what reason is there to believe in this day and age that anti-Semitism is any less of a threat now, here and now, than it was then and there. I've come to view it, frankly, as a virus running through history.
Yeah.
Some will seize upon it, others will fight against it. But putting aside, again, any and all similarities and differences, that's what I keep coming back to.
Yeah, I
And-
think, I'm
yeah,
sorry. go
Thank you.
ahead.
That's all. I'm just wondering for your comment.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think the big difference between what we're experiencing now and what happened in Germany is that the government was anti-Semitic. And when you have the power of the government to exercise against a group of citizens, that's different than what we're seeing now. I do agree, though, it's, I mean, I was born in 1960. I thought anti-Semitism was an ugly thing that raised its head very viciously once in a while, like the shooting here. But to have it on a daily basis on campuses and neighborhoods. Sarah's neighborhood had swastikas painted all over it. She's at the bottom of Squirrel Hill. I agree about the virus. I think for now, we are safe from it being incorporated into the government. And so that's a very different setup. It's not good, but it's not the same. We got to get the microphone to, yeah, sorry.
I don't agree with what you just said.
That's fine.
Because that distinction is a very thin line. Maybe for the moment, this government that was just elected hasn't shown an interest in being the Jew as the object of derision. But this government has shown others as being the object of derision. So I think the distinction you're making is really a fallacy. But for the grace of the moment, these laws that are now being enacted could be anti-Jewish laws.
They could be, but for Jewish citizens, there's still the protection of citizenship, which is why one of the first things the Nazis did was strip Jews of their citizenship.
Who is the author of the book where one of the bottom line was they took away so-and-so and I was silent and nobody protested.
Yeah,
They took away,
Niemöller.
And then finally there was no one left to protest.
Yeah, they came for,
So
yeah.
I don't find a lot of solace in your opinion.
So maybe I'm not being clear about, I think that it's our job as a minority group to recognize when other groups are attacked by the government and to see risk there.
But similar to what we just saw, the legislative, the civil service, and the judicial branches of German government were all co-opted.
Using Article 48, yeah.
And that's happening here. He wants to disband the civil service.
Well, let me tell you why I'm optimistic. Power in this country is spread out way more than, and I don't want to, have a debate, but.
No, but interestingly, in tonight's news, the district attorney in Philadelphia was being interviewed for a very interesting tact. It's like, statism, that states decide for themselves what to do, maybe something that could come back to haunt Trump. He's using each state shall decide for itself, abortion. The district attorney in Philadelphia tonight was being interviewed by saying that he believes certain of the actions of January 6th could relate back to state criminal violations.
And
I'm
the
not sure he's
president does
right.
not have the right to pardon.
That's the
state.
point, yes.
Yeah. And so this goes to my point of how dispersed power is in the United States. So think about where I'm licensed by, believe it or not, my law license is from the state of Iowa. I can't practice in Ohio. Someone practicing here, their license is from Pennsylvania. Even licensing attorneys is done at the state level. The rules are set by each state Supreme Court. We have bar associations are not governmental organizations. They're independent organizations. You have, obviously the separation of the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branches of our government. Sometimes different branches have functioned better. Personally, I think the legislature has been doing a big laydown for the last like decade or so, but the judiciary has generally, I mean, I can't tell you how many fights I've had with my parents about this. When a really conservative opinion comes out of the Supreme Court and I read it, I'm like, I understand where they're coming from. It's not a political opinion. It's interpretation of who has the power to control immigration. It's a question of who has the power to do certain things. I'm not talking about the Dobbs decision. But anyway, there is a lot of spread of power in this country. Then you have the states, and you have the federal government, and you have local governments and the state governments. And, you know, we just have power spread out everywhere. So I'm optimistic. I'm not certain, because all democracies can become dictatorships. We are not an exception. But yeah, I think it's important to, you know, to recognize the risks and realize that on a scale of 0 to 100, we're probably closer now than we were 30 years ago to becoming a dictatorship, but we're not there yet.
So this relates in the, you know, the collapse of German democracy. Was the problem that they did a bad job drafting the Constitution? Was it the economic circumstances coming off of, you know, a war in which they were defeated? Or was it something crucially deficient in the German people? Or was it a combination?
I think it was 1 and 2 and a different 3. I think that, you know, the different 3 is that because the Kaiser abdicated and there was nothing in place, a lot of people thought that the government of Germany, the Weimar government, was itself a revolutionary government, which it kind of was, right? I mean, there was a vacuum and then there was Weimar. It was supported by a lot of the people, but a lot of the, especially the non-Nazi right-wing parties, like the monarchists, they really felt that they should have gone back to a different kind of monarchy, or, you know, but that just the Weimar government was not legitimate. Jurists differ about whether the Constitution was badly drafted. Most of them think it was pretty well drafted, and that Article 48 was sort of a necessary thing given the fact that the war had just ended and there was a lot of economic problems. So I think it was part of those. You know, I don't think you can say any one people is more prone, in a way that's just as prejudiced as somebody saying Jews are a certain way, right? And I can tell you that I went to Germany 3 times researching the opera, and they have grappled with their history in a way we have not. So, and they were very generous, and in fact, I've been invited to, I don't think I got to tell you this, Drew. I've been invited to screen Sparks on May 4th, on the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Berlin. So, you know, is there a defect in the German people? I'm not willing to go there, because to me, part of the answer to this is to see everybody as an individual and not as part of a group. So that one I don't agree with, but the other ones I do. Sarah, do you want to read some? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Some other day we'll talk about Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus.
Yeah, so actually, Justice Rehnquist wrote a whole book about the suspension of habeas corpus. And so when I teach this to lawyers, and especially to law students, and they're like, I never would have issued a judicial opinion evaluating the Nuremberg laws. I would have just said they're wrong. Well, okay, let's think about, you know, the clerk in Alabama who wouldn't issue marriage licenses to gay couples because she was opposed to gay marriage on religious grounds. Well, how is that different? You know, like if we allow people to just, so it's a very complicated question is the answer, right? That you can't just say, well, you shouldn't do this and you should do that, because everybody has, you know, we teach our law students that they have to have a certain level of dispassion and keep their own political views out of it. So it becomes a very difficult question. Where's that line where you say, no, it's, I'm not willing to do that? Okay, questions from online.
Yes, so people on Zoom, forgive me, I'm going to go out of order just because one of the questions is a good follow-up to the conversation. The question is about sort of the capitulation of the German legal community, the judges and lawyers, whether there were any acts of resistance in that group, and what you can say about, it says to encourage us, given the way that Democrats and Republicans have sought to sort of talk about and fight over Supreme Court seats.
Yeah, so I don't think there were a whole lot of acts of resistance, but there is a new documentary out on Netflix, I think it is, that talks about this one lawyer whose name I can't think of. I'll send Drew the name, but a lawyer just wrote a book about this guy who basically did resist. And of course, there were the 90 whatever social democrats who voted against getting rid of the Reichstag. So there was some, but it was not widespread. And then I have a colleague at Georgetown, David Lubin, who had written this article about how most lawyers in the Nazi regime were interested in a new law comes out, you master it so you can litigate it. And so they just kind of had that lawyer like, oh, okay, this is the law now, I'm going to handle cases, I need to know this law. So.
And then there was just a question about the US situation with the courts and sort of the partisan.
Yeah, I don't even know what to say about that. I do not think the Supreme Court is as partisan as most people of my political beliefs think. I've actually read many of the opinions that they've issued because I teach a class where I have to talk about them. I was surprised at their interpretation of the statute that related to whether impeding Congress was actionable under this one section of the criminal law. I was a little bit surprised at the executive immunity decision because it really didn't decide the issue, it just made a mess. But when you look at who aligned in those opinions, I mean, it's not always predictable. Except for Alito and Thomas, they are always predictable. And actually on the left, the three, Kagan, they're predictable too. But, surprisingly, Amy Coney Barrett has turned out to be kind of in the middle. I think a lot of Republican appointed judges have been releasing these January 6th defendants and going on the record to say that this is, a power that the president has under the Constitution, but it's not right. And I do think you're seeing, I am actually quite proud of how most of the judiciary has behaved over the last, 10 years. So, do I agree with everyone? No. Do I think they're all honorable? No. But, for the most part, I think the judiciary has done its job fairly well. Congress, not so much.
And then there's just one other question about whether you have seen.
Can I just say, not because I don't agree with what Congress did, but because they can't get anything done, which in part is because of cloture and the, needing to get 60 votes for everything. So that's a whole nother conversation. Okay.
Just a question about whether you had seen, and also I guess to comment on the degenerate art exhibit at the Maltz in Cleveland.
I have not seen that, and I need to, but I have not had time, so I'm going to. I think I'm going to take this opportunity to just tell you what else is going on this weekend, because I know it's getting late, and I'm happy to stick around and talk to anyone who wants to chat. But tomorrow night, Susan. Okay, tomorrow night, we are gonna do 4 pieces from The Sparks Fly Upward as part of Shabbat. My dear friend Cathy Mansfield, who's the cantor at Congregation Mishkan Or in Cleveland, is coming to Pittsburgh to join us for services tomorrow night. She's gonna do the candle blessing from The Sparks Fly Upward. And then Danny Singer, so quick short story. I sang with the Cleveland Orchestra Chorus when I first moved to Cleveland. Danny is the associate conductor. I approached him to play one of the parts, and he was like, I don't want to play the part, but I'll conduct it. And I was like, okay, choral conductor, big orchestra. Are you sure you can do this? He was like, yeah, I got this. Oh my gosh, he is the best conductor. So Danny ended up being our conductor in Cleveland. Then he got the job with the Mendelssohn Choir here. And so he commutes once or twice a week to Pittsburgh. And then it turns out Danny went to high school with your cantor. And of course, Drew and I grew up in the same, I mean, like it's a Beschertz, right? So Danny will be there tomorrow. And then some of your congregants will be joining us. We're going to do a couple choral pieces from Sparks. And then on Saturday night, I'm really hoping you'll come to actually watch the movie of the production in Cleveland, which has been remastered by the sound engineer for the Cleveland Orchestra. He did such a great job. And also our video director, Cathy Sebo's husband. You know, we picked the best scenes, so you'll be watching the video. Dinner is at 5:30, and the show starts at 6, and there will be an intermission. And you can either bring your dinner or buy it here for $18, right? Because it's a temple.
If you want dinner from here, though, you have to sign up online so that we know to get you a meal.
And I hear you're doing a Davis Bakery thing next month from Cleveland, right? Has that been announced yet? Did I just spill the beans? Oh, never mind. I might come back for that because their corned beef's really good. Okay, yeah, question? The show's going to be in here in the social hall?
It's going to be in the auditorium.
In the auditorium? I didn't know you had an auditorium.
No, we have a screen in there, and also we can eat in there.
Yeah, that's why we're not doing it on Zoom, because we wanted to get the sound right. So I will be here Saturday practicing the sound for that. So, anything else? Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Professor Lesser Mansfield. This was amazing, and if you like what you see, she will be here Friday and Saturday.